Michael Lawson leaned heavily against the porch railing of his modest suburban home, staring out into the quiet street as the last rays of sunlight faded into twilight. At 40, Michael thought he had built a stable life, a respectable job in engineering, a home that resonated warmth, and a wife, Emily, who turned heads with her sharp wit and beauty. Their lives weren't perfect, but they were predictable, anchored in a routine that had kept them grounded for years. Or so he thought. The signs of trouble began like soft whispers in a dark room, barely audible at first but impossible to ignore once noticed. The first whispers came in the form of Emily's subtle changes. She had always been low maintenance, content with her favorite faded jeans and an old hoodie on weekends. Lately, though, her wardrobe had undergone a transformation. Chic blouses, fitted dresses, and an array of high heels appeared in her closet. When Michael asked about them, she waved it off, saying she wanted to feel more confident at work. He didn't press. He liked the idea of her feeling good about herself. But it felt like the changes were for someone else. Then there were the glances. It started at a family barbecue 2 months ago. Michael's younger brother, Brian, had arrived late, his signature easy charm on full display. He was 35 and the quintessential fun uncle, adored by Michael's kids for his playful antics and free-spirited ways. That day, Michael noticed Emily laughing a little too loudly at Brian's jokes, her gaze lingering just a second too long on his face. At the time, Michael brushed it off. Emily was just being polite, and Brian was naturally charismatic. But the memory stayed with him, replaying itself over and over, each iteration sharpening the edges of his unease. He told himself he was imagining things, that after 12 years of marriage, he was simply projecting his insecurities. But the doubts began to grow, fed by other small but glaring inconsistencies. Emily's phone was another thing. She used to leave it lying around, forgotten on countertops or the couch. Lately it was glued to her hand, always flipped screen side down. Whenever it buzzed with a notification, she would pick it up quickly, her lips pressing into a faint, secretive smile. One night, as they watched TV, Michael asked her about it. "Who's texting you so much?" he asked lightly. "Oh, just Lisa," Emily replied without hesitation. "She's planning some big birthday weekend, and she's being super extra about the details." Michael nodded, feigning indifference, but his stomach churned. He had heard Lisa's name thrown around too often lately. And Lisa's penchant for plans seemed suspiciously boundless. Still, he said nothing. He didn't want to be that husband, the paranoid one who interrogated his wife over harmless messages. Trust was the cornerstone of their marriage, and Michael didn't want to chip away at it without good reason. The good reason came 2 weeks later. It was a quiet Saturday evening. Emily had announced that she was meeting Lisa for drinks. Michael, worn out from a week of deadlines and late nights at work, had been content to stay home and watch a documentary. He kissed Emily goodbye at the door, noting her high heels and the tight dress she hadn't worn in years. "You look amazing," he said. "Thanks, hon," she replied, brushing his cheek with a distracted kiss. "Don't wait up for me, okay?" Michael nodded, turning back to the living room as she closed the door behind her. 2 hours later, as he scrolled through Netflix for something new to watch, his phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "Hey! Tell Emily I can't make it tonight. I came down with the flu. Sorry for the last-minute cancel." Michael's stomach dropped. He stared at the screen, rereading the message several times as if it might change. Lisa wasn't meeting Emily. So, where was she? And who was she with? The silence of the house felt oppressive. Michael paced the living room, his mind racing through every possible explanation. Had Lisa cancelled too late for Emily to change her plans? Was Emily out with other friends she hadn't mentioned? Or was there a darker reason, one that Michael had avoided confronting until now? He forced himself to breathe, to act normal. When Emily returned home later that night, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled, Michael played his part well. He asked if she had fun, and she replied with an enthusiastic "Yes," going on about cocktails and catching up with Lisa. He nodded, smiling in all the right places, but his chest felt like a vice was closing around it. The following weeks brought more revelations, each one chipping away at Michael's sense of stability. He noticed that Emily's excuses for being out late were becoming more frequent, and more specific. A last-minute work meeting. A gym session that ran long. Helping Lisa with her flu recovery. Then there was Brian. Michael hadn't initially connected his brother to Emily's strange behavior. Brian had always been a regular fixture in their lives, stopping by unannounced with beer and jokes, never staying too long but always leaving an impression. Michael had grown accustomed to his younger brother's carefree antics. But now, in the wake of Emily's changes, Brian's presence took on a new, insidious weight. At a family dinner, Michael noticed how Brian and Emily seemed to gravitate toward each other. Their private jokes. The way Emily's hand would occasionally touch Brian's arm as she laughed. The way Brian's eyes followed her whenever she left the room. Michael's unease began to solidify into something darker, something he didn't want to admit aloud. The breaking point came on a random Wednesday evening. Michael had stopped by his mother Joanne's house to drop off groceries, a favor he did every week, even though Joanne rarely seemed to appreciate it. As he approached the porch, he heard voices coming from the open kitchen window. "It's not his fault, Emily," Joanne said, her tone soothing but firm. "Michael's always been, well, boring. He works hard, but he doesn't understand passion. You deserve someone who makes you feel alive. And if that's Brian, then so be it." Michael froze, his heart pounding so hard he thought Joanne might hear it. He stayed rooted to the spot, his mind scrambling to comprehend what he'd just heard. Joanne wasn't just condoning the affair, she was actively supporting it. His own mother. When the conversation ended, Michael forced himself to knock on the door and deliver the groceries as if nothing had happened. Joanne greeted him with her usual warmth, none of her earlier conversation betraying her expression. Michael played along, but inside, something broke. That night, Michael sat alone in his car, parked a few blocks from home, gripping the steering wheel with trembling hands. The betrayal was no longer a vague suspicion, it was a living, breathing thing. His wife, his brother, and his mother were all complicit in tearing his life apart. Michael didn't sleep that night. Instead, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. By morning, he had made a decision: if they thought they could break him, they were gravely mistaken. He wasn't going to confront them yet. He needed a plan. Revenge, Michael decided, would come later, when they least expected it. Michael spent the days after that fateful discovery in a fog of disbelief and cold calculation. The betrayal felt like a wound that refused to stop bleeding. His wife, his brother, and his own mother, three of the people he trusted most, had collectively unraveled the fabric of his life. It wasn't just infidelity, it was a conspiracy cloaked in false smiles and casual conversations. Yet Michael didn't lash out. He didn't confront Emily or Brian, and he certainly didn't let on that he'd overheard Joanne. Instead, he played the part of the oblivious husband and devoted son, observing and gathering clues while pretending to maintain normalcy. If they thought he was blind to their betrayal, so much the better. The first step was gathering proof. Michael knew that accusations without evidence would lead nowhere, especially with people as cunning as Emily and Brian. Late one night, while Emily was asleep, he crept into the kitchen where she often left her purse. Her phone was tucked inside, locked, but Michael was patient. He opened her laptop instead, which she rarely used but hadn't bothered to password protect. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Emily's emails and private messages painted a vivid picture of her affair with Brian. They hadn't even bothered to be subtle. There were flirtatious exchanges, plans to meet at hotels, and even photos, selfies of the two of them laughing over drinks, posing at restaurants, and lounging in places Michael didn't recognize. Each image was like a punch to the gut, but Michael forced himself to keep scrolling, to collect as much as he could. He forwarded everything to a private email account and deleted any trace of his actions. The hardest part came when he discovered messages between Emily and his mother. Joanne's words stung more than anything else he'd seen that night. "He's so predictable, Emily. He'll never suspect a thing. You and Brian are the perfect pair. Michael's just too blind to see it. But you're doing the right thing. Brian makes you happy, and that's what matters. I'll always support you both." Michael clenched his fists, his knuckles white as he stared at the screen. His own mother had orchestrated this. She had encouraged Emily to betray him and validated Brian's selfish actions. For years, Joanne had subtly favored Brian, but this went beyond sibling rivalry. It was treachery of the highest order. Once he had enough evidence, Michael moved to Phase 2, surveillance. He wanted undeniable proof, the kind that would ensure his revenge left no room for denial or excuses. He purchased a set of discrete cameras and microphones online, spending hours researching how to hide them effectively. By the end of the week, their home was a web of hidden technology. Cameras were tucked into vents, microphones embedded in the walls, and even his car was rigged to record conversations. The recordings started yielding results almost immediately. On a Friday afternoon, Emily had invited Brian over, claiming to Michael that she was having Lisa help her rearrange the living room. Michael, already suspicious, pretended to have a late meeting at work. He parked his car 3 streets away and monitored the live feed from his phone. Brian arrived within minutes of Michael's departure, and the two wasted no time. They sat on the couch, close enough to touch, their voices filled with the kind of easy intimacy that only came from shared secrets. "I hate sneaking around," Brian said, laughing. "But it's almost worth it just to see the look on Michael's face when he has no clue." Emily smirked. "He's always been like that. So focused on his job, so serious. It's exhausting. With you, it's just fun. Easy." Michael's jaw clenched as he listened. It wasn't just betrayal, it was mockery. They didn't just cheat on him, they belittled him, laughed at the life he'd worked so hard to build. By the end of the night, Michael had hours of footage and audio of their interactions. They were damning, explicit, and undeniable. But he wasn't ready to strike yet. He wanted to hit them where it hurt the most, and that required patience. Meanwhile, Michael began digging into Brian's life. His brother had always been a charmer, but charm only masked his lack of discipline. Michael found that Brian was deep in debt, credit cards maxed out, a car loan in arrears, and a gambling habit that had bled his bank account dry. Joanne had been bailing him out for years, something Michael had suspected but never confirmed. The real revelation came when Michael uncovered the depth of Brian's financial dependence on Joanne. His brother had leveraged her favoritism to secure tens of thousands of dollars in loans, money that Joanne had siphoned from her retirement savings. Michael couldn't believe the extent of her naivety, or perhaps her willingness to support her golden boy at any cost. Now Michael had leverage. The final piece of the puzzle came unexpectedly. One afternoon, while reviewing more surveillance footage, Michael overheard Emily talking on the phone. She was planning to leave him. The timeline wasn't clear, but the intent was unmistakable. She and Brian were waiting for the right moment, likely after Emily secured a financial settlement from the inevitable divorce. Michael's stomach churned at the thought, but it also gave him an opening. If they were counting on his ignorance, he'd turn it into a weapon. To anyone on the outside, Michael seemed unfazed. He went to work, mowed the lawn, and even joined Emily for dinner dates, acting every bit the oblivious husband. Inside, though, he was sharpening the tools of his revenge, each day bringing him closer to his goal. Emily's behavior only emboldened him. She came home late, sometimes drunk, offering half-hearted excuses that Michael didn't even bother questioning. She mistook his silence for acceptance, not realizing he was collecting every lie, every slip-up, every cruel laugh. Even Joanne's attitude became more brazen. During a family gathering, she openly praised Brian's supportive nature, while subtly undermining Michael. "You could learn a thing or two from your brother," she quipped, a sly smile on her face. Michael forced himself to laugh along, the weight of his plans burning in his chest. By the end of the month, Michael's preparations were complete. He had evidence, leverage, and a strategy that would not only expose their betrayal but leave them reeling. But as much as he anticipated the moment of confrontation, he knew he couldn't stop there. True revenge, Michael realized, wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about ensuring that those who betrayed him felt the consequences for years to come. For now, though, he played the waiting game, each passing day sharpening his focus. Michael wasn't just a man wronged, he was a man preparing for war. Michael felt like an actor in a long-running play, his role demanding perfection in the face of mounting betrayal. Every interaction with Emily and Brian required restraint, every conversation with Joanne felt like swallowing broken glass. Yet he endured it all, knowing that his patience would soon pay off. If they thought he was blind, he would ensure they never saw his next move coming. The surveillance yielded more than Michael could have imagined. Brian's arrogance seemed to know no bounds. In one particularly infuriating recording, Brian bragged to Emily about how he had been playing the long game. "Michael always thought he was the smart one," Brian said, reclining on Michael's couch, a beer in hand. "But he doesn't have the guts to see what's happening under his nose. I've got everything, his wife, his mother's support, and soon his money." Emily laughed lightly, curling her legs beneath her on the couch. "It's his fault for being so boring. I mean, who spends their entire life being so predictable? You're different. You make me feel alive." Michael paused the recording, his jaw tight. They weren't just betraying him, they were reveling in it, flaunting their disrespect in the very home he had built. But this time, their words didn't break him. They fueled him. He replayed the recording twice, committing every smug word to memory. Soon, they'd regret every syllable. In addition to the emotional betrayal, Michael uncovered another layer of treachery: his finances. Emily had begun siphoning money from their joint account, funneling it into a savings account he hadn't known existed. It wasn't much, just enough to avoid detection under normal circumstances, but it was deliberate. Michael's deeper dive into their financial history revealed a pattern. She had started making withdrawals shortly after Brian became a regular visitor to their home. Hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and even a luxury watch purchased with his credit card painted a clear picture. She wasn't just hiding an affair, she was preparing to leave him high and dry. But Emily wasn't the only one abusing his finances. Joanne, too, had dipped into his goodwill. Michael had helped manage her bills for years, often writing checks to cover shortfalls in her retirement fund. Now he discovered that much of that money had gone straight into Brian's pocket. The betrayal stung, but Michael didn't dwell on the pain. He saw it as a tool, a way to tighten the noose around their collective necks. He met with his financial advisor, quietly transferring assets out of joint accounts and securing them in trusts under his name. Emily wouldn't get a penny if she tried to file for divorce. He also cut off the funds he had been supplying Joanne, knowing she'd soon realize the consequences of enabling Brian's recklessness. Michael maintained his role as the loving husband and dutiful son. At family gatherings, he laughed at Brian's jokes, even as his brother smirked like a man holding all the cards. At home, he played the part of the supportive spouse, nodding along as Emily recounted tales of her busy days at work. But cracks began to show in their confidence. One evening, Michael casually mentioned a promotion he was up for at work. It would mean a significant pay increase and more financial stability. Emily's smile faltered for a split second before she recovered, offering a half-hearted, "That's great." Later, when Brian came by, Michael caught a whispered exchange between the two. "If he gets that promotion," Emily said, her voice tinged with worry, "it'll make things harder for us. He'll have more control over the money." Brian scoffed. "Don't worry about it. We've got this. He's clueless." Michael pretended not to hear, but their unease gave him a sense of satisfaction. They were beginning to doubt themselves. He was winning without them even realizing it. One day, Michael received a call from an unlikely ally, Lisa, Emily's supposed best friend. Her voice was tight with anger. "Michael, I don't want to get involved," Lisa began. "But I can't stay quiet anymore. Emily's been using my name as an excuse for her activities. She's not meeting me when she says she is." Michael thanked Lisa, though he already knew. Her confirmation was another nail in the coffin of Emily's lies. He assured her that he wouldn't involve her further but appreciated her honesty. That evening, Michael set a trap. He told Emily he had a work function to attend and wouldn't be home until late. As expected, she called Brian the moment Michael left the house. Thanks to the surveillance, Michael listened in real time as she invited Brian over. He didn't confront them. Instead, he drove to a nearby coffee shop, his laptop in hand. He began organizing the damning evidence he had collected: recordings, financial statements, and photos. By the time he returned home, Brian was gone, and Emily was fast asleep. Michael smiled grimly. They had no idea how close they were to their reckoning. The next day, Michael paid a visit to Joanne. She greeted him with her usual air of superiority, offering him coffee and a forced smile. But Michael wasn't there to play nice. "Mom," he began, his voice steady but cold, "I need to know why you've been helping Brian and Emily betray me." Joanne's eyes widened in shock, her composure slipping. "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael placed a folder on the table, filled with transcripts of her messages to Emily and evidence of the money she had funneled to Brian. "Don't lie to me, Mom. I have everything." Joanne's face crumpled. "Michael, I thought they were happy together." "You've always been so focused on work, and Brian, he understands her in ways you don't." Michael stared at her, disgusted. "You chose him over me. Your own son. Do you realize what you've done?" Tears welled in Joanne's eyes, but Michael wasn't moved. "I've cut off your access to my money. You want to support Brian? Do it with your own savings, what's left of them." Joanne gasped, her hands trembling. "Michael, you can't do that. I'm your mother." "I could," Michael replied, his voice ice cold. "And I did." He left her house without looking back, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Joanne might have been his mother, but she had forfeited any claim to his loyalty. Michael's careful planning was reaching its climax. He had the evidence, the leverage, and the resolve. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, and nothing would stop him now. Michael woke early on a crisp Saturday morning, the dawn light filtering through his bedroom window. Emily was still asleep, her face serene, as though the lies she carried bore no weight. Michael stared at her for a moment, the faint rise and fall of her chest almost hypnotic. The betrayal that had turned his life upside down was still invisible on her face, a mask of normalcy hiding everything rotten underneath. He didn't feel love for her anymore, just a cold determination to see his plan through to the end. The first step of his strategy was simple: isolate his enemies. Over the next few weeks, Michael quietly cut ties where it mattered most. Joanne, stripped of his financial support, had already begun to backtrack. She had called him several times, leaving voicemails filled with guilt-laden apologies, but Michael ignored them all. Joanne might have thought she could manipulate him, but those days were over. Emily and Brian were next. Their overconfidence was their Achilles heel. They assumed Michael's calm demeanor was ignorance, but it was exactly what allowed him to gather the final pieces he needed to execute his plan. One afternoon, while Emily was out, working late, Michael set up a meeting with a divorce attorney. Sarah Kane was a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for dismantling even the most conniving adversaries in court. Michael laid everything on the table: the recordings, the financial discrepancies, and even the texts between Emily and Joanne. Sarah's lips tightened as she flipped through the folder he'd brought. "You have more than enough to build a case," she said. "This level of documentation will leave her with nothing, especially given the financial deceit and infidelity." "That's the idea," Michael said, his voice steady. "But I don't just want a clean divorce. I want them both to face consequences." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You're not just after justice, you're after revenge." Michael didn't flinch. "I want them to feel the weight of what they've done. No shortcuts. No easy outs." Sarah nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Then let's get to work." The following week, Michael invited Brian over for dinner. It wasn't unusual for Brian to drop by, but this time, Michael made it clear he was extending a formal invitation. Emily, of course, played along enthusiastically. "It'll be nice to have everyone together," she said, her tone sickeningly sweet. Michael nodded, masking the contempt simmering just beneath the surface. Family's important, after all. By the time Brian arrived, Michael had everything prepared. The dining room table was set with their best dishes, and a bottle of expensive wine sat chilling by the window. Michael greeted Brian at the door with a broad smile, clapping him on the back as if nothing were amiss. "Glad you could make it," Michael said. "We don't get enough of these moments, do we?" Brian smirked, his usual self-assuredness radiating from him. "You're right. Life gets so busy." Emily joined them shortly after, her smile bright as she kissed Michael's cheek in a show of affection. Michael returned the gesture, playing the part of the doting husband one last time. Inside, he was already savoring the fallout that was about to unfold. As dinner progressed, Michael kept the conversation light, asking Brian about work and cracking jokes that had Emily laughing too loudly. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. He could see the furtive glances Brian and Emily exchanged, the subtle undercurrent of their secret connection. When dinner was over, Michael poured each of them a fresh glass of wine and leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but deliberate. "I've been doing some thinking," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "About life. Family. Trust." Emily's laughter faltered. Brian's smile wavered. "What do you mean?" Emily asked, her voice a touch too casual. Michael set his glass down, locking eyes with Brian. "I mean trust, Emily. The foundation of any relationship. Wouldn't you agree?" Brian shifted in his seat, his confidence beginning to crumble under Michael's steady gaze. Emily opened her mouth to respond, but Michael cut her off. "Let's not pretend anymore," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "I know everything." The room fell silent. Emily's face turned pale, her hand tightening around her glass. Brian's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Michael stood, pulling a tablet from his pocket and tapping the screen. Moments later, the room filled with the sound of Emily and Brian's voices, captured in crystal-clear detail. It was one of their recorded conversations, the one where Brian mocked Michael's cluelessness, and Emily complained about his predictability. Emily's glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. "Michael, I can explain." "Don't," Michael said, his voice cold. "I've heard enough of your lies." He turned to Brian, who looked like a deer caught in headlights. "And you? My brother. My own blood. You thought you could steal from me, lie to me, betray me? You're a disgrace." Brian sputtered, his usual bravado replaced by desperation. "Mike, come on, man. It's not what it looks like." "Save it," Michael snapped. "You think I didn't see this coming? You think I'm some fool you can manipulate? You've both underestimated me for the last time." As the truth hung heavy in the air, Michael delivered the final blow. "I've already spoken to my attorney. Emily, I'm filing for divorce, and you'll be lucky to leave with the clothes on your back. Brian, I've cut off every lifeline you've leeched off me for years. You're on your own now." Emily collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands. Brian stared at Michael, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "You don't have to do this, man. We're family." "Family?" Michael said, his voice laced with venom. "You don't even know the meaning of the word." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "You've both made your choices. Now live with them." As he walked away, he could hear Emily sobbing and Brian cursing under his breath. Michael felt no pity, no regret. This was only the beginning of their unraveling. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. The house that had once been a battleground was now his domain again, and the people who had sought to tear it apart were left with nothing but the ruins of their own deceit. The silence in the house after Michael's confrontation with Emily and Brian was almost suffocating. Emily had retreated to the guest room, her tear-streaked face pale and haunted. Brian had left in a flurry of anger, slamming the door on his way out. For the first time in weeks, Michael felt something close to peace. But his satisfaction was short-lived. This wasn't over yet. The next morning, Michael filed the divorce papers, ensuring Emily would be served within days. Sarah, his lawyer, assured him that their airtight case would leave her with little leverage. The evidence of infidelity, combined with her secretive financial dealings, meant that Emily would walk away with nothing. Michael felt a grim satisfaction knowing that her betrayal wouldn't be rewarded. But revenge against Emily wasn't enough. Brian's arrogance needed to be dealt with as well. Michael had spent weeks gathering information on his brother, uncovering debts, failed business ventures, and a paper trail of reckless decisions. He wasn't just exposing Brian's betrayal, he was dismantling the illusion of success that Brian had clung to for years. Michael's first move against Brian was subtle but devastating. Using the financial details he'd uncovered, Michael contacted several of Brian's creditors anonymously. By highlighting overdue payments and providing evidence of mismanagement, he ensured that Brian's financial woes would come crashing down all at once. Within days, Brian's phone was flooded with calls demanding repayment. When Brian called Michael, his voice was laced with desperation. "Mike, I need a loan. Just enough to get these collectors off my back. Come on, man, you know I'm good for it." Michael's response was cold. "Good for it? You've been borrowing money from Mom for years, and now you expect me to bail you out? You're on your own, Brian. Don't do this," Brian pleaded. "We're brothers." Michael's laugh was humorless. "Brothers don't stab each other in the back. You made your choice." Brian's bravado crumbled. Without Michael's financial safety net, he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. His landlord served him an eviction notice, and his car, leased under false pretenses, was repossessed. The charismatic, carefree Brian was now a shadow of himself, scrambling to stay afloat. Emily, too, began to feel the weight of her decisions. News of the divorce spread quickly among their social circle. Michael didn't actively share the details of her betrayal, but he didn't need to. Small-town gossip had a way of doing the work for him. At first, Emily tried to control the narrative, painting herself as a victim of Michael's workaholic tendencies and emotional unavailability. But the truth had a way of surfacing. Lisa, Emily's former confidant, let slip the real reason behind the divorce during a conversation with mutual friends. Soon, the story of Emily's affair with Brian, and Joanne's involvement, was common knowledge. Emily's reputation took a nosedive. Friends who had once admired her charm and poise began to distance themselves. Invitations to social events dwindled. The women she'd once gossiped with at brunch now whispered about her behind her back. Michael heard through the grapevine that Emily had been approached by a lawyer of her own, but with no grounds to contest the divorce, her position was weak. In a last-ditch effort, Emily tried to appeal to Michael's sympathy. One evening, she cornered him in the kitchen, her voice trembling with desperation. "Michael, please," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can start over." Michael didn't even flinch. "Fix this? After what you and Brian did? After you mocked me in my own home? No, Emily. There's nothing left to fix." Her tears turned to anger. "You're not perfect, Michael. You've ignored me for years, always putting work first. What did you expect?" Michael's eyes narrowed. "I expected you to respect the vows we made. To come to me if there was a problem. Not to run to my brother behind my back." Emily had no response. She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Michael felt no satisfaction, only a deep, abiding resolve to see this through. Meanwhile, Joanne had been reeling from her own financial troubles. Without Michael's support, she struggled to maintain her lifestyle. Her retirement savings had been depleted from years of bailing out Brian, and her once pristine credit was in shambles. She called Michael multiple times, leaving increasingly frantic messages. "Michael, please call me back." One voicemail pleaded. "I'm your mother. I know I made mistakes, but we need to talk." Michael never returned her calls. He had no interest in repairing a relationship with someone who had so blatantly betrayed him. Joanne's attempts to rally other family members to her side fell flat. Most had heard about her role in Brian and Emily's affair and wanted no part in the drama. Eventually, Joanne showed up at Michael's doorstep, looking haggard and desperate. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I thought I was helping. I didn't realize." Michael held up a hand, cutting her off. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Mom. You chose Brian over me. You encouraged Emily to betray me. There's no coming back from that." Joanne's face crumpled. "I'm still your mother. And I'm still your son," Michael said, his tone icy. "But that doesn't mean I owe you forgiveness." He shut the door in her face, leaving her standing on the porch. It was a cold, final act, but Michael felt no remorse. Joanne had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. As the weeks turned into months, the pieces of Michael's plan fell into place. Emily moved out of the house, leaving behind the life she had once taken for granted. Brian, drowning in debt and with no one left to manipulate, disappeared from their social circles. Joanne, stripped of her financial lifelines, sold her home and moved into a modest apartment. Michael, meanwhile, began to rebuild. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, became a sanctuary of independence. He redecorated, removing every trace of Emily and replacing it with things that brought him peace: a new coat of paint, artwork that spoke to his resilience, and furniture that reflected his new beginning. Though the scars of betrayal lingered, Michael felt lighter with each passing day. He had survived the storm, not by ignoring the pain but by facing it head-on and refusing to let it define him. The reckoning was far from over. Michael knew that Brian and Emily would feel the ripples of their choices for years to come. But for now, Michael was content. He had regained control of his life, and his enemies were left to pick up the pieces of their own shattered worlds. The winter months were cold but clear, a stark contrast to the emotional storms that had engulfed Michael's life. With Emily gone and the divorce proceedings nearing their conclusion, he finally felt a semblance of control. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the hum of daily life subsided, he found himself haunted by memories of betrayal. Healing was not a linear path, but it was one Michael was determined to walk, no matter how long it took. He poured himself into work, taking on challenging projects that kept his mind occupied. His team noticed the change. Michael was more focused, more driven, and his leadership earned him a promotion that Emily would never benefit from. The irony wasn't lost on him. It was the kind of career milestone she'd once pushed him to pursue, though now it served as a reminder of his independence. Despite his progress, there were still loose ends that Michael couldn't ignore. Brian had retreated into the shadows, his once carefree lifestyle now a distant memory. Joanne, stripped of her enabler's role, rarely reached out anymore, her pride unable to withstand Michael's cold rejection. But Emily still lingered like an unwanted specter. She had taken an apartment across town, using what little money she had left after Michael froze their joint accounts. Occasionally, he heard through mutual friends that she was struggling. Gone were the designer clothes and lavish dinners she'd once flaunted. Her new reality was one of modest survival. Michael didn't gloat at her misfortune, but neither did he offer her any reprieve. She had made her choices. It was late one evening when Michael received a text from an unknown number. He frowned, unlocking his phone to read the message. "Mike, I need to talk. Please. It's Brian." Michael's first instinct was to ignore it. He owed Brian nothing, not his time, not his sympathy. But curiosity got the better of him. Against his better judgment, he responded with a terse reply. "What do you want?" Brian's response came almost immediately. "I'm in trouble. Can we meet? I'll explain everything." Michael agreed to meet him the next day at a neutral location, a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. When Brian arrived, he looked worse than Michael had ever seen him. His once pristine appearance was gone, replaced by disheveled clothes and a face lined with worry. "I'm not here to help you," Michael said bluntly as Brian slid into the booth across from him. "So, whatever this is, make it quick." Brian fidgeted with his coffee cup, avoiding Michael's piercing gaze. "I messed up," he admitted. "Big time. The debts, they've caught up with me. I'm getting threats, Mike. Real threats. Michael's expression remained cold. And you think that's my problem? Brian's desperation spilled over. I know I screwed you over, okay? I know I don't deserve your help, but you're my brother. If I don't pay these people back, I don't know what they'll do. Michael leaned back, his arms crossed. You used that same line on Mom to bleed her dry. And now you're here, hoping I'll be your next savior? It's not like that, Brian said, his voice cracking. I'm scared. For a brief moment, Michael felt a pang of pity. But it was fleeting. Scared? You weren't scared when you were sneaking around with Emily. Or when you stole from me and lied to my face. You don't get to come crawling back now and expect me to clean up your mess. Brian's shoulders sagged, his face crumpling. I'm sorry, Mike. I really am. I don't know what else to do. Michael stood, tossing a few bills on the table. Figure it out, Brian. You made this bed. Now lie in it. As he walked away, he felt no regret. Brian's spiral was self-inflicted, and Michael had no intention of rescuing him. A week later, Emily showed up at Michael's door unannounced. He opened it to find her standing on the porch, bundled against the cold. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. What do you want, Emily? He asked, his voice devoid of emotion. I need to talk to you, she said, her breath visible in the icy air. Please. Michael hesitated before stepping aside to let her in. He led her to the living room, where they sat on opposite ends of the couch like strangers. I know I'm the last person you want to see, Emily began, her voice shaky. But I'm here to take responsibility. Michael raised an eyebrow. Responsibility? She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I've lost everything, Michael. You, the life we built, my reputation. I can't fix what I've done, but I want you to know that I regret it. Michael watched her silently, his face unreadable. Her words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to salvage something. I don't know what you expect me to say, he finally replied. Regret doesn't undo what you did. Emily looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. I wanted you to know that I see it now. How selfish I was. How I let myself get caught up in something I thought would make me happy. But it didn't. It ruined me. Michael's gaze hardened. You didn't just ruin yourself, Emily. You tried to ruin me, too. I know, she whispered. And I'm sorry. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Then Michael stood. I appreciate the apology, but it doesn't change anything. We're done, Emily. You need to move on. Emily's tears spilled over, but she nodded. Without another word, she rose and left, the door closing softly behind her. As the months passed, Michael began to feel the weight of his ordeal lifting. The divorce was finalized, leaving him free of Emily's shadow. Joanne's calls became less frequent, her attempts to reconcile met with silence. Brian disappeared entirely, his life unraveling in the wake of his poor choices. Michael focused on rebuilding, not just his home, but himself. He joined a local hiking club, finding solace in nature and the companionship of new friends. He started painting again, a hobby he had abandoned years ago. Slowly but surely, he rediscovered who he was beyond the pain. One spring morning, as he stood on a cliff overlooking the valley, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. The betrayal that had once defined him was now just a chapter in his story. He had survived, and in doing so, he had become stronger. Michael smiled, the warmth of the sun on his face a reminder that life could begin anew. Michael's life had become a study in quiet triumphs. The chaos of betrayal had been replaced with a newfound appreciation for simplicity. His mornings were spent tending the garden, his evenings filled with books he'd always meant to read. He wasn't just moving on, he was thriving. Yet, even as he rebuilt, a part of him remained tethered to the unfinished business of his revenge. Emily's apology had been sincere, or so it seemed, but Michael couldn't forget the harm she'd caused. Brian's downfall was satisfying, but his brother's absence from town left Michael wondering if Brian was truly facing his consequences, or running from them. And Joanne, his own mother, had retreated into silence, her once dominant presence reduced to occasional gossip relayed through distant relatives. Michael was ready for closure, but he wanted it on his terms. One afternoon, Michael decided to visit the downtown market. The smell of fresh bread and the chatter of vendors created a vibrant atmosphere that felt like a world apart from the darkness he'd endured. As he browsed the stalls, a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "Michael?" He turned to see Joanne standing by a display of fruits, her face pale and drawn. She looked older, more fragile, her once imposing demeanor replaced by a nervous energy. For a moment, Michael considered walking away. But something in her eyes gave him pause, a mixture of regret and desperation. "Mom," he said evenly. "What are you doing here?" Joanne hesitated before answering. I've been meaning to talk to you. I know I've made mistakes, Michael, and I wanted to apologize. Properly." Michael crossed his arms, his expression guarded. "You've had months to reach out. Why now?" Joanne sighed, clutching her purse tightly. "Because I didn't know how to face you. I know I failed you as a mother, siding with Brian, encouraging Emily. I see that now, but it's too late, isn't it?" Michael stared at her, his heart a mix of anger and pity. Joanne had been complicit in his betrayal, but her crumbling figure before him no longer seemed like a villain, just a woman who had lost everything. "It is too late," he said after a pause. "But I'll listen. Say what you need to say." Joanne nodded, her voice trembling. "I thought I was helping. I thought Brian needed me more than you did, that Emily was just looking for someone who understood her. I didn't see how much damage I was doing until it was too late. I'm sorry, Michael. I truly am." Michael's expression softened, but only slightly. "You hurt me more than anyone else. Not because of what you did for Brian or Emily, but because I trusted you. I'll accept your apology, but don't expect things to go back to how they were." Joanne's shoulders slumped, but she nodded. "That's more than I deserve." Michael left her standing by the fruit stall, her apology lingering in his mind. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step toward closure. Michael didn't expect to hear from Brian again, but fate had other plans. One evening, as he returned home from a hike, he found an envelope tucked into his mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note. "Mike, I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm asking for one. I'm back in town, trying to rebuild my life. I need to face you man to man. Meet me at the bar we used to go to, tonight at 8. I'll be there." Michael considered throwing the note away, but his curiosity won out. He arrived at the bar a few minutes early, the familiar scent of beer and fried food bringing back memories of simpler times. Brian was already there, sitting at a corner table, his face gaunt and shadowed by guilt. "You came," Brian said, his voice subdued. "Don't make me regret it," Michael replied, sitting across from him. Brian fidgeted with his drink, his usual confidence completely gone. "I've hit rock bottom, Mike. Lost everything. No money, no friends. Mom's struggling because of me. I don't even know who I am anymore." Michael studied him, searching for signs of manipulation but finding only raw honesty. "And what do you want from me? Forgiveness?" Brian shook his head. "No. I don't expect that. I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. For everything. I messed up, and I know I can't fix it, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Michael leaned back in his chair, considering his brother's words. "You betrayed me in ways I can't even begin to explain. But if you're serious about rebuilding your life, you need to do it without me. You've burned too many bridges, Brian. It's time you learned to swim on your own." Brian nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "I understand. Thank you for hearing me out." Michael left the bar without looking back, his heart heavy but resolute. He couldn't let Brian back into his life, but he could walk away knowing he'd said his piece. Michael's final encounter with Emily came unexpectedly. While driving home from work one evening, he spotted her leaving a small cafe with a coworker. She looked different, less polished, more subdued. She wore a simple coat, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. There was no sign of the confident, glamorous woman she once was. Out of curiosity, Michael parked his car and approached her. She froze when she saw him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you here," he replied. "How's life treating you?" Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground. "It's different. Humbling, I guess. I'm working at a temp agency, trying to piece things together. I don't blame you for hating me." "I don't hate you," Michael said, surprising even himself. "I just don't feel anything anymore." Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I wish I could go back and undo everything. But I know that's impossible." "It is," Michael agreed. "But maybe you can learn from it." She looked up at him, a faint smile breaking through her sadness. "Maybe." Michael walked away, feeling a strange sense of closure. Emily was no longer the woman who had shattered his world. She was simply a person trying to find her way, just as he was. With Joanne's apology, Brian's confession, and Emily's acknowledgement of her mistakes, Michael felt the weight of the past finally lifting. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was enough to let him move forward. For the first time in months, Michael allowed himself to dream of the future. He envisioned a life unburdened by betrayal, filled with purpose and joy. And as he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized he had won. Not through vengeance or cruelty, but by refusing to let their actions define him. Michael Lawson had been broken, but he had rebuilt himself stronger than ever. And for that, he was grateful. Michael stood on the porch of his home, the warm glow of sunset casting long shadows across the yard. The house had undergone a quiet transformation over the past year. Where once it was filled with the echoes of betrayal and heartache, now it was a sanctuary, a place of peace and resilience. The garden he had replanted bloomed with vibrant colors, each flower a testament to his new beginning. Inside, the walls displayed artwork that he'd painted himself, abstract yet deeply personal, symbolizing his journey from ruin to renewal. But today wasn't about looking back. Today was about moving forward. For months, Michael had been working on a plan, not one born of revenge or anger, but one that would close the final chapter of his old life. It was time to tie up the last loose ends and ensure that those who had betrayed him were left with no illusions about the consequences of their actions. The opportunity presented itself during a community event held at the town hall. It was a fundraiser for local charities, one that Michael had quietly helped organize. He knew the people who mattered would attend: Emily, Joanne, and even Brian. Despite their individual downfalls, they couldn't resist an opportunity to re-enter the social fold, to claw back some semblance of respectability. Michael smiled to himself as he imagined their reactions to what he had planned. The hall buzzed with energy as families mingled, laughter and conversation filling the air. Michael greeted everyone warmly, his calm demeanor masking the anticipation simmering beneath the surface. As he moved through the crowd, he spotted Emily near the refreshment table. She looked anxious, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for something, or someone. Brian was nowhere in sight, but Michael knew he would show up. Joanne stood in the corner, speaking quietly to a group of older women who cast Michael nervous glances as he approached. "Good evening, everyone," Michael said smoothly, his tone polite but firm. The women murmured awkward greetings before quickly excusing themselves, leaving Joanne alone with her son. "Michael," Joanne began, a forced smile on her lips. "It's so nice to see you here. I've been meaning to." "Save it, Mom," Michael interrupted, his voice low. "You said your piece. I'm here to finish mine." Joanne's smile faltered, but she nodded, stepping aside as Michael continued through the crowd. The fundraiser culminated in a series of speeches from the event organizers. Michael had been invited to speak last, a position he had specifically requested. As he took the stage, the audience quieted, all eyes turning toward him. He scanned the room, noting Emily seated near the middle, her posture stiff. Joanne stood at the back, her face unreadable. And Brian had just entered, lingering near the door, his disheveled appearance drawing a few curious stares. Michael cleared his throat and began. "Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This community has been a cornerstone of my life, especially over the past year. Tonight, I want to talk about rebuilding, not just homes or projects, but ourselves." The room was silent as Michael continued, his voice steady. "A year ago, my life fell apart. I discovered that the people closest to me, those I trusted most, had betrayed me. It was a betrayal so deep, so painful, that it could have destroyed me. And for a while I let it." Emily's face turned pale, her eyes fixed on Michael as his words hung in the air. Joanne shifted uncomfortably, and Brian's expression darkened. "But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom," Michael said, his voice rising with conviction. "You discover what you're truly made of. You find strength in places you never thought to look. And you learn that sometimes, the best revenge isn't about hurting those who hurt you, it's about refusing to let them define you." The audience murmured softly, a wave of sympathy and admiration rippling through the room. Michael locked eyes with Emily, his gaze unwavering. "I rebuilt my life piece by piece," he said. "I didn't do it out of spite or anger, but because I refused to let their choices rob me of my future. And standing here today, I'm proud to say that I'm stronger, wiser, and happier than I've ever been." The applause was thunderous, but Michael wasn't finished. As the room quieted again, he delivered his final words. "To anyone here tonight who's struggling, who feels broken or lost, remember this: you have the power to rise above, to create something new, and to leave the past where it belongs." Michael stepped down from the stage, the crowd rising to their feet in a standing ovation. Emily's eyes glistened with tears, but Michael didn't look back at her. Joanne clapped hesitantly, her expression a mixture of pride and shame. Brian stood frozen by the door, his face unreadable. As the event wound down, Michael slipped away quietly. He didn't need to stay for the obligatory handshakes or accolades. His message had been delivered, and he felt no need for validation. Instead, he returned home, the cool night air refreshing against his skin. That night, as he sat on his porch with a glass of wine, Michael reflected on how far he'd come. Emily's tears, Joanne's regret, and Brian's silence, they no longer had power over him. He had faced them all, not with rage, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. In the weeks that followed, Michael's life continued to flourish. He began volunteering at a local youth program, mentoring kids who reminded him of his younger self. He started dating again, cautiously but optimistically, allowing himself to imagine a future filled with genuine connection. Emily moved out of town shortly after the fundraiser, unable to face the whispers that followed her. Joanne downsized to a small condo, her influence in the family reduced to distant holiday cards. Brian vanished once more, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. Michael's world, once shattered, was whole again, stronger for the cracks that had been mended. As he stood on the porch one morning, the sun rising over the horizon, Michael allowed himself a rare smile. Life hadn't turned out the way he planned, but it had given him something better: resilience, clarity, and peace. For the first time in years, Michael felt truly free.